My name is Brian Birch. I'm the director of the Religious Studies program here at Utah Valley University and have the pleasure of working with President Holland in the Academic Affairs Office. It's been delightful to advance the work of interreligious dialogue over the past several years, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to work alongside some of the finest colleagues in this community and on this campus. Again, I want to thank Dr. Mao for his willingness to come and be part of this dialogue, both the academic side, the devotional side, and I'll say a few more words about that in a few minutes. I also want to thank President Matthew Holland for being part of this discussion, and I will explain in more detail the format in a few minutes, and you'll see exactly the value that Dr. Holland brings to this discussion as well. Many of you know that Utah Valley University is in the midst of what we're calling an interreligious engagement initiative. And it comprises a whole variety of academic events, student activities, and other kinds of activities for students to both absorb and learn about other faith traditions, to enter into dialogue about other traditions, but also to feel comfortable and have a safe place where students can be religious beings or can express themselves in ways they find of value to them if they choose not to follow a religious path. It's been an honor to work with President Holland on some of these initiatives, and I just want to talk about a couple of them. Most of you should have received a little booklet that talks in greater detail, but I want to call your attention to just a couple of things. The first one is that within the next 6 or 7 months, we are going to be opening a student reflection center on campus. And this will be part of the new Student Life and Wellness building that you see under construction and that impeded your parking in some cases when you came to campus. It'll be a 2,000 square foot space that is dedicated to students being able to meditate, reflect, pray, engage in other forms of religious expression, but also it will be a space set aside for dialogue and discussion. And so we plan to host a variety of student clubs and workshops, book groups, and other kinds of activities that really engender a spirit of cooperation between different student groups on campus. As part of that initiative, we are forming a new Interfaith Student Council. We've been forming it this past year. We have representatives from 8 different student clubs, ranging from the InterVarsity Student Club, Baptist Student Association, Muslim Student Association, the Latter-day Saint Student Association, and others. And so we are very active on this campus trying to promote this sense of inclusivity that many of you have heard President Holland talk about and that we take very seriously here. One of the things that we're committed to in principle is that we're trying to combine the academic lives of students and the experiential lives. And so that's reflected in the Reflection Center space that I just talked about. And it's also reflected in the kinds of events that we are hosting. And so this morning, you got a very good taste of interfaith cooperation at the Orem Institute of Religion. We're also very interested in the serious, thoughtful, reflective academic study of religion in cross-cultural contexts, in comparative contexts, so that we can go beyond the ceremonial aspects of interfaith work and really get down to the issues that both unite us and divide us in this very complex society. So with that end in mind, we are hosting this panel. As we mentioned, it's a student workshop, and so Dr. Van Dyke and myself, Blair Van Dyke, have been conducting a workshop for students at UVU. It's a 1-credit-hour seminar that is focused specifically on Mormon evangelical relations. And so we have been reading Dr. Mao's Talking with Mormons, We've been reading Stephen Robinson's and Craig Blomberg's How Wide the Divide, and a variety of other readings that deal with specific issues in this dialogue. And it's just been an honor and a pleasure to be involved in the Mormon Evangelical Dialogue group that Dr. Bob Millett and Dr. Mao assembled several years ago. And I'm a relative latecomer to this, but it's been an honor to be part of it, and it's deepened not only my understanding of evangelical Christians, but Christianity in general. The format is going to be divided into two parts. The first part is going to be focused on some of the theological issues that we've discussed in class with the students. And we're going to dwell on two areas primarily. The first one is the nature of God. And as Dr. Mao mentioned on a couple of occasions, this has been one of the theological issues in play between Latter-day Saints and evangelicals, right? What is the nature of God? What is the relationship between human beings and God? And the like. And so the students have focused in and done some specialized readings on this topic. We're also going to spend a few minutes talking about the nature of grace. And that's another one of these topics that has been that's had a real presence in these Mormon evangelical dialogues. And as Dr. Mao mentioned, they've been very beneficial to both sides of this discussion. So the students are prepared to ask questions on those two topics. I'll be leading that discussion, and then the second half of the workshop will be led by President Holland, and it will be focused on issues related to religious freedom, the place of religion in society, and how these issues relate across Mormon evangelical lines as both sides are intensifying their efforts to focus on some of these issues. So with that in mind, we want to remind you that during the Q&A session, because we're being recorded, please raise your hands. The microphone will come to you, and just pause to start your questions so that we can get everything on film. So with that said, when we talk about the nature of God, Dr. Millett mentioned in his devotional address the differences between the understanding of God that he reads in the Book of Mormon, for example, and the King Follett sermon, which was one of the later sermons that Joseph Smith taught during the Nauvoo period. And during the time that I've been involved in the
You said Millett.
Did I say
he
Millett?
He doesn't want to be identified with me. So.
Dr. Mao, excuse me, Bob.
He's got his own problems without.
Yeah. Thank you. The King Follett sermon has been a particular point of emphasis and has come up again and again because it represents a way of understanding Mormonism that, as Dr. Mao mentioned, is a sticking point. And so the students and Dr. Van Dyke and myself have worked through the King Follett sermon. We've also worked through other texts in the LDS tradition and in the evangelical tradition, and so with that, we'll open it up to student questions.
Dr. Mao, in your opinion, if the King Follett sermon idea of God was abandoned or pushed to the side in Mormon tradition, do you feel that we would be accepted as another Christian denomination within Christianity?
Yeah, thanks. There are actually a couple questions there. One is, one of the big issues, of course, is Trinitarian doctrine. And I think just on a normative level, it's pretty hard to think of a theology being Christian that denies the doctrine of the Trinity. So, and the King Follett discourse does a lot more than that. So I would say it'd be a lot better if the King Follett discourse wasn't there. But the other question is about the Trinity. But let me just say something about King Follett. In Mormonism, with its view of continuing revelation and the prophetic office being restored, there's a tendency to see later as sort of clarifying, maybe not improving upon or correcting, but later as clarifying earlier. And in that case, if King Follett is seen as an explication or a clarification or a further elaboration of what we find, say, in the Bible or in the Book of Mormon, that would be highly problematic. For example, Joseph himself, in Doctrine and Covenants 2017, in 1830, an address that he gave, he says, "We know that there is a God in heaven who is infinite and eternal, from everlasting to everlasting, the same unchangeable God, the framer of heaven and earth and all things which are in them." I mean, that sounds pretty good from a traditional Christian point of view. Fairly essential to the Christian doctrine of God traditionally are the omni-attributes of God, that God's omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent. And Joseph seems to be operating with that conception of God. We can also find it in the Book of Mormon all over the place. So how do we understand the relationship between later and earlier there? And I think that's a very important question for the LDS community to clarify. And if it were somehow to, and I think this happens in Mormonism. I'm not saying I want it, I'm not recommending, I'm just saying, as I read the history of Mormon, the development of Mormon doctrine, there's a tendency to put more things toward the center and leave other things on the periphery. Bob Millett has a nice image that there are even some things that are up there on the shelf. And I've got shelf doctrines. I think we all do. Somebody was asking me about the Calvinist idea of the limited atonement this morning, and I said, well, of the 5 tulip doctrines, L is my shelf doctrine. It's up there. If you make me take it off, I'll dust it off. I'll argue for it. But it isn't something I live with every day, that God only elects some people and the rest are going to hell. I don't sit around thinking about that and doing my devotions about that or anything. And I think in Mormonism there are also some shelf doctrines. So if the King Follett discourse would be put on the shelf and not talked about much. One more comment. When Gordon Hinckley was interviewed at Time Magazine, President Hinckley, and they asked him about the Lorenzo Snow couplet. That response of his, well, yeah, I used to hear a lot about that. We don't hear about that much lately, and I've never really quite been clear about that. That was, I think, a good Mormon statement of that's just not at the center of our focus anymore. Especially what man now is, God once was, that part of it. And so I think in evaluating the Mormon doctrine of God, we need to look at not just early versus later, but what functions in the life of the community. When you people sing, "How Great Thou Art," are you interpreting that? And Bob doesn't like me to keep telling this, but Everett Taft Benson went to a Billy Graham rally when he was in the Eisenhower cabinet and heard "How Great Thou Art" back in the late 1950s. And had it put in the Mormon hymn book. Well, now you get "How Great Thou Art." It doesn't sound like King Follett discourse. And so the question is, on a functional level, is "How Great Thou Art" and Joseph Smith in 1830, in 1830, is that more the functional understanding of God when you people pray and sing and talk to each other? Or do we need to understand all of that in terms of what they're really thinking about as the King Follett discourse? If that's the latter, I think we've got real problems. But I sense that I don't think the King Follett discourse among a lot of Mormons really functions much anymore, and I don't think it's a guiding teaching. Now the other question is doctrine of the Trinity, and That's a bigger question. But as David Paulson himself has argued, there's a seeming compatibility between some of the early church formulations, especially the Cappadocian Fathers, who had a social Trinitarianism where they tended to veer toward tritheism. The Christian community, we've never had a single-minded doctrine of the Trinity. We've tended toward modalism, where it's one being with three job descriptions, or a tritheism. And if the tendency toward tritheism, as in social Trinitarianism, is an acceptable part of the mix, then it might even be possible someday for the LDS to say, well, in that sense, we're probably Trinitarians. Might be. Three persons of the Godhead. You already say that. Sorry, I won't say as long.
No, it's a great answer. While we're on the question of embodiment, one of the things that has surfaced and continues to surface is the status of evangelical thinking on the post-embodiment nature of Jesus, because Latter-day Saints will often use that as a way of leveraging their arguments for the embodiment of God, that the necessity of Jesus being resurrected bodily is important, and I think it's something that a lot of evangelical traditions continue to affirm, but there seems to be conversation and debate and discussion as to what exactly that means, how literally to take that within your communities. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because in the Reformed tradition, as opposed to Lutheranism and Catholicism, there is this very strong emphasis that he ascended to heaven. He took our human nature to heaven with him. And the angel saying, in like manner he shall appear, that we shall see him. I mean, you get a very clear sense that it's an embodied Jesus that will appear on the clouds, and all flesh, all eyes will see him, Revelation 1. I think in many ways that's the question of the continuing embodiment, or the continued incarnation of Jesus as the one who ascended bodily into the heavens. That's a non-issue in terms of the kind of thing that we can disagree about among ourselves as evangelicals. Now, whether that says anything about the embodiment of God the Father is another question.
Yeah, and that leads to the next question, because one of the more startling aspects of the King Follett sermon was Joseph's, very direct statement about, if you were to pull back the veil, you would see God in like manner, in all form and likeness to a human being. So oftentimes Latter-day Saints will ask me, well, what is the Reformed, or what is the evangelical conception of, is something like that even thinkable within evangelical theology?
Yeah. Well, I just want to allow for a lot more mystery than Joseph does in the King Follett Discourse. I mean, now we see through a glass darkly, then we see face to face. It doth not yet appear what we shall be, but when he shall appear, we shall be like him. We just don't know enough yet about what it's going to be. C.S. Lewis once said that to convince an adult that heaven is better than this is a lot like convincing a 2-year-old that sex is better than chocolate. And it's just a great mystery, and it's hard for us to imagine what it's going to be like. And I'm not sure what I would see if the veil were lifted. So I just don't know. Yeah.
Throughout progression of Christianity through the centuries, and in Reformation of the Protestant churches and things like that, would the ante-Nicene writings be, if they were more influential on those Reformations, how would Christianity view King Follett now, and how would that maybe be more acceptable?
Yeah, I see. So if we had not had the Nicene Creed, but if we had focused primarily on the conceptions of God and of Jesus prior to Nicaea. Would King Follett be more acceptable? It's a little hard to imagine that. That's a good question, though. And one of the things that, quite apart from King Follett, but one of the questions that we have, or one of the methods that Bob and I agreed with, and we've had some wonderful times following through on this, is suppose if we disagree about Nicaea, let's go back and work our way toward Nicaea and see at what point we start to get nervous and at what point we actually disagree with each other. And so we started with, what does the New Testament say about Jesus? And we found nothing really to disagree about that. And I think as we look at some of the early church fathers and the patristic writings prior to Nicaea, we have a lot of agreement on that. But Nicaea, I think probably as much as we might disagree about what the Nicene Creed says, and I mean, I disagree with Stephen Robinson and others that Nicaea was imposing Greek Platonistic categories on primitive Christianity. But as much as we might disagree about the substance, there's the whole question of the very need for Nicaea. And as my LDS friends know, I want to argue that I think that the LDS is still in a pre-Nicene period. Read the last issue of Sunstone, which I've been reading now for at least a dozen years. You've got you've got Jungian Mormons, neo-pagan Mormons, feminist Mormons, Freudian Mormons, Mormons who sneak off to Anglican services. If you were to poll Mormonism on the nature of who Jesus Christ is, you would get many different conflicting answers within Mormonism. And for some reason, the authorities have not seen it as necessary to give any definitions. But I think there may come a time when the church authorities are going to have to say, is that out of bounds? And if so, they'll probably write something like the Nicene Creed.
Well, that raises interesting questions, and I was reminded of a story that might be useful to share here. Several years ago, certain professors at BYU were involved in the Society for Christian Philosophers. Yeah. And one of the agenda items one year was whether or not to host the Society for Christian Philosophers at BYU. And the vote went to the committee, and they ended up voting against the society taking place at BYU because this society could not hold a conference at a college or university that did not affirm the Nicene Creed or that positively rejected the Nicene Creed. And because the committee deemed that Latter-day Saint theology was outside those bounds, it decided not to host the meeting. That's not the most interesting part of the story, though. The more interesting part was the fact that some of us in the LDS community wanted to engage our colleagues in exactly what it is about the Nicene Creed that Mormons could not affirm. Mm-hmm. And so that launched a very interesting set of conversations, exactly along the lines that Richard was talking about, where there was a lot of clarification, and it came down to the point there was agreement that there were only one or two clauses in the Nicene Creed that Latter-day Saints positively could not affirm. Now, of course, there's going to be debate and disagreement within the LDS community, but in its most generous state, I think that Mormons could affirm most of it, and that we could build upon those, and we have been building upon those ever since.
Just say I'm a visiting scholar at Pepperdine University this year, and on that criterion, it couldn't be held at Pepperdine either, because the larger restoration movement denies no creed but Christ. Doesn't accept the Nicene Creed either, as do the Quakers and a number of other groups. So you can be a Trinitarian and still not accept the Nicene Creed. And so there's an inconsistency in all of that as well.
Yeah, one of the challenges with that episode as well was the fact that the criterion was kind of developed on the fly and after the fact as a way, many believe, to marginalize Mormons explicitly. And I believe that it was, you know, it was unfortunate, but it certainly was an educational exercise, both in Mormon theological circles and discussion, but also I think among philosophers and theologians of more mainstream persuasions. So with that, more questions. Oh,
I also have a question.
he's got the microphone
I have a mic,
privilege.
so. Dr. Mao, thank you again for coming. With the divide that exists in theology between evangelicals and Mormons, do you think that it would be possible to, as things are now, continue to better the relationship that exists between the two religions? Or do you think that there will become a plateau and a stopping point for the relationship?
Well, that's a good question. I'll say more out of hope than out of, I'm not a prophet, but I would hope that we would not simply plateau. I would hope that we could find enough exciting things to do together. And as those of us who have been involved in the dialogue know, we haven't nearly covered it all. We've got a lot more to talk about. And I think that as we talk more together, I do not hold to the view that what we're trying to do is make Mormons become evangelicals, and I don't think that my LDS friends are holding out that all the evangelicals involved will become Mormons. But as much as possible, we want to be sure that we really do, that where we thought we disagreed is a real disagreement, or whether it's a clarification. I think it's okay to say this, but early on, Bob Millett, when we started the dialogue, said, you know, we Mormons have been out of dialogue, out of contact with historic Christianity in terms of serious discussion for 150 years, and we're not sure we always use the right language. And so we have found that as we can agree on our formulations and even revise them insofar as we're not departing from what we believe, but we're trying to clarify what we believe. And very often our dialogues will say, well, let me try this out. Would this be a way to say it? That I think we will see a lessening of the areas of serious disagreement. And even with some of those serious disagreements, I think they will be not unlike disagreements that evangelicals and Mormons have within their own communities with each other. And so I don't think we'll plateau. But you know, Grant, and there are a number of others here who can comment on that from the LDS side, who've been very much involved in the dialogue. And you?
Well, I agree. I think there's a lot more to talk about, and that we've barely really plumbed the depths of what we can do, and there's a lot to learn.
And if we believe in eternal progression, we'll keep talking about this for all eternity. Maybe have to yell at each other from the celestial to, you know. But
Well, the higher levels can go visit the people. At the
okay,
lower
good.
levels, so.
Well, it's up to you folks then to make contact.
Okay. Any more questions from students about nature of God?
So I'm interested in the evangelical perspective on the importance of a spiritual regeneration, the born-again experience being actually creating a new being inside you. And I'm wondering if, from your perspective and the evangelical perspective, a grace works balance like Mormonism has is somehow in conflict with that. Like, in order, like, to believe that one must be an active participant in one's spiritual growth, works-based progression, would that prevent authentic, actual metaphysical spiritual regeneration?
Yeah. No, thank you. Just the way you put it there from the Mormon side, I don't see anything objectionable about it. In fact, the scriptures say we work out our salvation in fear and trembling. Faith without works is dead, all of that. But to go back to the fundamental question, regeneration, we've always understood as the planting of a seed, and then the seed grows. And just as, say, an acorn, when planted, eventually becomes the trunk and the branches and the leaves, so the process of sanctification that begins in regeneration is that process of actualizing those potentials that are there in the seed, but are merely potential. And the Christian life then is the process of growing into the fullness of Jesus Christ, which I think is an eternal process, but it has to be happening. And so the planting of the seed is the planting of the new nature in our sinful hearts that gradually crowds out more and more the sinful tendencies and actualizes the growth. So, but now, the Mormon bicycle story and that kind of thing, you guys do a lot with bicycles, even still. I don't know quite what to know about that, but I heard a sermon a while back that went like this: that if your boat capsizes 30 miles from shore, let's say 100 miles from shore, you're probably not going to make it to the shore, no matter how good a swimmer you are. If your boat capsizes 1,000 miles from shore, you're probably not going to make it. And we can swim pretty far, but all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There is none that is righteous. And so the righteousness is a gift from God that comes from God's gracious movement toward us. And our good works, and I can appeal to Camille Franck on this, that our good works are our response to God's grace and do not earn salvation. And so I'm not sure we're all that far apart on that. I mean, if you want to say, well, grace takes over at that point where we can't do anymore, well, then the real question is, what's the status of what we can't do anymore, or what we've done up to that point? And the basic issue is, quite apart from how we formulate it, if God does not move toward us graciously, we're lost in our sin. And that's the important thing to recognize.
On that note, we've been talking quite a bit in our seminar about the nature of grace, and we've been talking about the spectrum of grace, the spectrum of positions on grace. And so one of the questions that I've posed in previous papers and previous conferences is the extent to which Latter-day Saints are guilty of the heresy traditionally of Pelagianism. And for those who are familiar with Christian history, Pelagianism is connected to the idea that one could merit the grace of God through good works that were connected to a robust concept of freedom and free will. And then there are views in between, as some of you know, semi-Pelagianism, Arminianism, the traditional kind of classic Calvinism. And one of the things that I've been probing with Bob Millett's writings and others is the extent to which Mormons can understand God's grace as both regenerative, right? You use that word, that's a good point of discussion, but also this notion of prevenient grace. Because Bob Millett, for example, uses the word prevenient grace to describe what is being talked about in the Book of Mormon. And it's just a fascinating issue, the extent to which traditional Christians and Mormons could come together on this kind of two-step process or two different understandings of grace in their attempt to reach out. I think Camille Franck's understanding of grace is about as far as Mormons have been able to reach toward Calvinists on that point. And of course it resonates with you, but it doesn't resonate with other Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, and I think, I don't see Mormonism as Pelagian, but I think you're Arminians. And that would be, you agree with that? Huh? Yeah. And I don't accept the doctrine of prevenient grace. The doctrine of prevenient grace is that we all, within, say, certainly traditional Christianity, we all start with the Calvinist idea that the fall totally ruined us. And then the question is whether there's a measure of grace that's kind of a universal upgrade that God gives that frees the will to go beyond what it would be able to do if we were completely left in our depravity. And so the emphasis on free will, free choice, that you find in Arminianism and also in Catholic doctrine is related to that doctrine of prevenient grace. I want to argue with that, but that's an argument that takes place within evangelicalism. And so it's not an argument that we ought to be, I mean, that's so important to get at, that we can't take every disagreement as a disagreement between the good side and the bad side or something like that, because many of the things, I mean, the Nicene thing, for example, you say, well, to be a real Christian, you got to believe in the Nicene Creed. Well, you really think that Alexander Campbell wasn't a Christian because he denied, said that there are no creeds that but Christ, or that Quakers can't be Christians because they don't accept the Nicene Creed? I mean, so we've got to be consistent on it. And I think once we pay attention to those questions of consistency, we can tone down some of the criticisms that we have of each other.
Now, one of the dangers of participating in a panel discussion when you reference people's writings who are in the audience is you do a danger of not allowing them voice. So, Bob,
if I say he said it, he said it.
Please.
What would you like me to say?
It's a nice opportunity to talk about prevenient grace.
Yeah, I think what I see, I think the Mormon equivalent to prevenient grace are two things. One, what we call the light of Christ, or what the Christian world calls general revelation. A moving on the part of God, people toward Him. But the Book of Mormon also talks about agency coming through the atonement, and because Christ had redeemed us, men were free to choose for themselves. And so it seems to me that two elements are almost inbuilt. They're within this planted thing we call the light of Christ or the Spirit of Jesus Christ, and the right to choose. That those make us or place us in a position to receive the message when it comes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Other questions on grace, please.
My question actually is on doctrine in general. With the doctrine of grace, with doctrine of Trinity, with any other doctrine inside the evangelism, without a priesthood hierarchy, how do you prevent doctrinal drift? How do you prevent the doctrine from changing without a priesthood hierarchy?
Yeah. Well, I guess a quick question back to you is, with a priesthood hierarchy, how do you prevent doctrinal drift? If evangelicals hold to the solas of the Reformation, sola scriptura, sola gratia, grace alone, Scripture alone, Christ alone saves. And I think the argument about doctrine has to be under the authority of the Word of God. And we need to, if we disagree about things, and we'll continue to disagree, but it's always relevant in an evangelical setting. But the Bible says this. How do you account for that? And it's in that dialogue under the authority of the Word that we set boundaries, that we decide where a person has gone over the edge in terms of doctrinal heterodoxy. I don't know that that's all that different than what happens, for example, in the First Presidency. My sense and this is a historical argument that is obviously open to objections from my LDS friends, but one of the things we've talked a lot about in the past is that the highest office in the Catholic Church is the magisterium, the teaching office. And even though I disagree with Catholicism on something like the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that Mary was born freed from original sin, because as the one who would bear the Savior, she had to be freed from original sin. I disagree with that. But in Catholicism, they come to that by saying that's a kind of logical outcome of a reasoning process that begins with the virgin birth and follows a rational path toward that conclusion. So if you disagree with it in Catholicism, you have to go back and see whether there were some missteps along the way. That's very different than a prophet of the church on Thursday saying that blacks are restricted from the priesthood, and on Friday saying now it's okay. In other words, there's not that same sense of organic development and continuity. It looks like two disparate. God said one thing on Thursday and the next thing on Friday. Now I don't think that's the operative view of the prophetic office anymore. My sense is that there's a kind of communal discernment of how to introduce new teachings that are consistent with and that flow out of the past. And as some of my LDS friends have said, you're never going to again find the president and prophet of the church going into a closet by himself and then coming out and saying this is a new teaching. But it's going to be a magisterial communal discernment among a community of authorities. And in that sense, that's not unlike the more general process of standing under the authority of the scriptures and indeed of the traditions of the church and discerning what is a new thing that we can say in continuity with what has been said in the past. So I'm not sure that the process that you're pointing to by a priestly hierarchy is all that different. Yeah.
Good. This might be a good point to transition so that we can talk about some of the issues in religious freedom and then open it up for more general questions and answers. One of the other dangers of being on a panel with your boss is that if you don't divide time appropriately, it could have ramifications down the road. So with that said, I will defer to President Holland.
I've been watching.
In an evangelical world, nobody would ever defer to me like that. There's something Mormon about this.
You are 3 minutes over, Brian, so it's just in time delivery. Well, first of all, I want to say welcome to Dr. Mao to Utah Valley University. We were with him earlier over the Institute for a wonderful session over there that was very moving and instructive in many dimensions. It does prompt me to look forward to my future as Franklin Graham. It's a little inside joke from the last session. Anyway, and I want to compliment Brian and his colleagues here at UVU. This is really an important part of what we are about at Utah Valley University. And it's near and dear to my heart personally, and it's, I think, spread throughout the institution, not because of me per se, but just because there are a lot of people here who really are interested in this inclusive outreach and in a way that lets Mormons be active, visible Mormons, but reaches out to people who are not LDS or not believers. There's just a place here on this campus for everybody, and to be here together and to move through our life collectively the best as we can without asking each other to abandon our differences per se. And so I think this is an important moment. I want to thank Brian and his leadership on that front, and these events make a difference, and we are looking forward to a new reflection center that will be, I think, an answer for non-LDS students to have something akin to what our LDS students have over at the Institute. So we're thankful for the way these things seem to be coming together, and you're an important part of that, Dr. Mao, your visit today. Let me cut into the religious liberty, the civic side of the equation here by, when I think of the intersection of interreligious dialogue and politics, I can't help but think of a favorite story of that paragon of civic virtue and integrity and unanimity, Huey Long from Louisiana. And Huey is former governor of Louisiana, sort of an infamous old soul. And as the story goes, he was taken to campaign down in New Orleans, in a very Catholic part of the state, and was warming up the parish, which is what some of the political components are still called down there these days, and spoke to the crowd, warming them up, saying, "Now, when I was a young boy, I'd get up every morning at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, and I'd hitch the horse to the cart, and I'd take my Catholic grandparents to Mass. And then I'd bring them home and feed and water the horse, and then I'd take my Protestant grandparents to church at 10 a.m. And that's the kind of home I grew up in." And then went on to give his stump speech, and it was very well received. And afterwards, an aide was complimenting him. I said, "Governor, that was great. The audience really cottoned to that, and I had no idea that you had Catholic grandparents." He said, "Don't be a darn fool. We didn't even have a horse." Why do I tell that story? A couple of things. One is to say, when you move into the realm of politics, politics has its own logic. So whatever we may think theologically about the Mormon evangelical relationship, if you start to layer politics on that, that begins to complicate the analysis, I think, because it introduces a whole set of incentives and processes and avenues of interaction that can take what's already the complicated nature of a theological debate and intensify it and make it even murkier in some ways with different competing social civic issues that are at play. And I think that is true when we think about the Mormon evangelical divide. I also tell it because in some ways I would suggest that the civic relationship between Mormon and evangelicals is not unlike the Catholic Protestant relationship of the late 80s, early 90s. I would put it in those terms. So let me say just a word or two about that, and then pose a couple of questions for our guest and open it up. That is to say, back in the 80s, something was starting to happen between what's been a fairly historic anti-Catholicism view from evangelicals and probably an analogous feeling on the Catholic side towards Protestants in many respects in the country, at least from a civic perspective. And that starts to change in the 80s, I think, in some important ways. I think two figures are important in this story. One is Father John Newhouse, who in the 70s starts to gather a group of intellectuals to challenge secularism, to say that we are losing the battle to those who say the public square must be empty of any religious content or argument or rhetoric. And he writes this famous book called The Naked Public Square, and his task is to bring these intellectuals, mostly Catholic conservative intellectuals, to bring to bear on this question about how we can clothe the public square, if you can, in the language of religion to some extent. They weren't arguing for necessarily a theological reign, but they were there to say that there are public issues that religion can speak to and needs to speak to and ought to be able to speak to. At the same time, that sort of starts in the 70s. It really begins to pick up steam and extend its reaches in the 80s, at the time that Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority are having a prominent influence on American electoral politics and energizing a certain sort of Protestant, by and large Protestant concern and evangelical concern within that for the state of American politics and where things are headed. And by the end of the 80s, there's these two things operating somewhat independently, I think start to eye each other warily, but with some interest, to say there might actually be more here that we have in common than we thought of in the past. And then it starts to take on some different dimensions with other leaders. Chuck Colson's out of prison and sort of reborn and friendly with the Father Newhouse crowd, and there are other leaders that fit into this mold that start to have some kind of a convergence where there's still a little bit of a wariness, but there's this growing sense of we may have some things in common civically, culturally, that we'd be better off to work together on than to let our theology get in the way of and make us so opposed on. And I think that's somewhat analogous to where we are today with Mormon evangelical relationships in the civic square, and that actually the driver is two things. Or at least they've sort of coalesced around two things. And one of them is Mitt Romney. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think in a way even more important than Mitt Romney is the marriage issue. And in some ways you might be able to trace the sort of the spectrum of Mormon evangelical debate around the marriage issue itself, with the nadir being 1856 and the Republican platform that talked about eliminating the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. That's where I think the marriage issue created much more of a divide, civically speaking, than Joseph Smith running for president or any other phenomenon that you might point to. And it's in the election of 2012 where Proposition 8, maybe even more importantly than the Mitt Romney candidacy, says something to certain evangelical leaders who are concerned about the marriage issue and see an organization in California unlike perhaps anything they were familiar with or could achieve themselves, to say that was pretty significant, and this was an issue we cared about, and these were people that we connected with. Now, I say that with all the qualifications to know that that's a controversial issue, and we shouldn't make any assumptions that all Mormons came down on the same issue. But generally speaking, there was a broad Mormon thrust there, and I think a positive evangelical response to say maybe we could do business together at some level, and created a real thaw, civically speaking, to people who otherwise may not be involved in these more sophisticated theological debates, but are just Mormons and evangelicals on the ground, and start to see a commonality they didn't think existed before. So I think that's a component. And then there is the Mitt Romney issue. Now, the Mitt Romney issue, I think, is very interesting. We're still asking ourselves this question. I'm invited to a conference at Notre Dame a little later to deal with this issue. Did Mitt Romney's Mormonism cost him the election? And in a nutshell, I'll just say I don't think that the answer to that is yes, in the sense that it's simply because he was a Mormon and he couldn't carry the Protestant and or evangelical debate that he cost him the election, but it certainly contributed. I think it contributed in two ways. One is that if you look back at the primary, the primary election was very costly to Governor Romney. He had to spend an extraordinary amount of money to challenge an intra-party response that was somewhat unprecedented in many respects. And a lot of it revolved, I think, around concerns associated with evangelicals and others about what he believed in, who he was, et cetera. And so he had to spend more money than he otherwise would have spent. He had to make arguments that might have been saved for a general election. And by the time he comes out of it, both the coffers and some of the intellectual energy are a little spent, and he goes silent over the summer. A lot of people thought he was just unresponsive. I've talked to people in the Romney campaign who say, we were just out of money. We did not have the way to get back to respond to in the general election attack from the Obama campaign, because we had exhausted so much in the primary in ways that we didn't think so. And then in the general election, there is just evidence that some evangelicals just stayed home. They didn't vote for Obama, but they just couldn't bring themselves to vote for Romney. Again, I don't think it cost him the election in the full sweep of things, but it was definitely a contributing factor, and it highlights a kind of the opposite side of this issue that from the Prop 8, which is Mitt Romney's candidacy created a very interesting dilemma, I think, for evangelicals, which is, on one hand, this sense that on many social issues he came closer to where many of them are, and they were looking for a candidate, but his election would lead to this sort of affirmation or legitimacy that gives Mormonism more of a platform, and that's a threat to our faith. And I do think that there was progress made, if you will, in people who started to see that as less and less of an issue. But I think there is evidence, again, in the depressed general election turnout, that for some that was just an insuperable obstacle. And so it leaves at least a significant swath of evangelicals concerned and torn to say, these are people I like, we share our values at least in many respects, but boy, I'm uneasy about what it means to give them such a public platform and to have that kind of legitimacy. And so, thus, the analogy to Catholics and evangelicals in the 80s and 90s. We're still a little wary of each other, but there's this growing convergence that is really, in some ways, independent of the higher theological issues that may be bringing us together in ways that could complement this current dialogue. So, with that much of a position laid out, let me ask Dr. Mao just for his reaction to this perspective about the state of the civic relationship between Mormon and evangelicals, and maybe something of that history. If your view is different, in what ways would it be different, or how you see the state of things?
No, I think that's extremely helpful, and I agree with your overall analysis. The only things I would add are that, Tim George, evangelical, who's been very involved in evangelicals and Catholics together, says that one of the movements of evangelicals and Catholics being more friendly to each other is what he called the ecumenism of the trenches. It is, if you had the leaders of the evangelical movement meeting with the bishops of the Catholic Church, we would have been arguing still about the Virgin Mary and other kinds of things. What happened was that in the Right to Life movement, evangelicals and Catholics met each other, very ordinary ones, and there was a kind of trickle-up effect. And I think we're seeing some of that trickle-up effect in evangelicals and Mormons. That's not to put down the leadership at all. So I think that's a very important part of the picture. I do agree that there were evangelicals who stayed home. I also think that it was a step forward in a lot of ways. Bob and I did a debate, a dialogue in downtown Chicago a week before the election. There was a guy there who was one of our funders who stopped funding Fuller because I was involved with the Evangelical Mormon Dialogue. He showed up that night, and he came up and said, "You're doing a wonderful thing. This is just really great." You know why? Because he disliked Obama so much that he was going to vote for Romney. And I kind of made him feel a little better about Mormons, And I think we're at a moment now where the Romney campaign actually is an occasion for doing more, both together, but also talking about the theological issues and in the ways that we've been doing on a less public context. So I think there were some. I don't think there were losses so much as continuing hesitancy and overcoming hesitancy. But I don't think the hostility, except for a very small group, probably on both sides, a very small group, there's still a kind of overt hostility. Let me just say a couple of things about the religious freedom question. I was, Elder Clayton and he reminded me today that we met in my office in California to plan our shared strategy on Proposition 8. And we did work together, evangelicals and Mormons, along with some others in California on that. and that was a good cooperation. I think one of the problems that we face, here's a kind of simple-minded analysis that Andy Crouch, one of our younger evangelicals, who's very much a student of culture, has pointed out. Around 1980, evangelicals decided to fight the sexuality issues through legislation. The gay lesbian movement decided to fight it through situation comedies and through Ellen DeGeneres and things like that. The result of these 3 decades or more on the gay lesbian side is that they have created empathy for themselves. The results of our legislative efforts have created hostility toward us. And so we've got simply have to face that we've lost this thing. If anybody could talk about a moral majority in 1980, it ain't there anymore. Those of us who hold to these values we've lost the battle in terms of same-sex marriage and related things. There are 2 questions that remain. One is, are we going to take a gentler tone? You know, I had a student come to me at Fuller Seminary, and she said, you know, I agree with the stand that you took on Proposition 8. I have no disagreement with your theology, with your ethics. But I got to tell you, my sister's a lesbian. And she thinks because I go to the seminary that the president took such a strong stand that I'm a part of a group that hates her. And she said, I love my sister. And furthermore, she said, my parents are so upset about her being a lesbian and in a partnership that they will not allow her to come home for Thanksgiving this year if she brings her partner with her. And she said she won't come if she can't bring her partner. And this young evangelical woman started to cry. She said, I just want to be with my sister. I'd be glad to sit at this Thanksgiving table. There's a younger generation in evangelicalism and in Mormonism that have friends who are gays and lesbians. They have friends who are in same-sex marriages. They're related to people. And many of us in the older generation have given the impression that we represent a position that is hateful, homophobic, and you know, judgmental. And somehow we've got to find a way not to abandon our convictions, but to be kinder and gentler, to do what I was talking about this morning with gentleness and reverence, on a pastoral level. And I find that the LDS authorities in the last year or 2 have assumed a different tone, a more pastoral tone, without abandoning their convictions. And I think we need to be talking together about that, because the other issue is the religious freedom question. I don't know about your school here, and you don't have to worry about it, but I'm sure BYU does. 80% of our tuition income at Fuller Seminary comes in the form of federal loans. If legislation that President Obama, who I've got to say I voted for, but if President Obama follows through on things that he has said, we will not be allowed to receive federal monies unless we stop restricting our admissions policies and our hiring policies, which, given our convictions, we can't do. And I don't think Brigham Young can do it either. And then we're going to really be shafted financially on this. I mean, this is a huge issue. And so we need to be thinking about not so much winning the battle, the big battle, because that's over with, but how do we preserve the right of faith communities to configure their life together in ways that are consistent with their deeply held and long-standing religious convictions about these things. And I've got to say, it's not just the civil rights of individuals, it's the rights of communities to live in accordance with what they believe. And this is a big issue right now. And one of the strategies, and I know the LDS authorities agree on this, is that at least some of us need to work together, not saying we want our rights as Mormons or we want our rights as evangelicals. I think the best thing we could do together right now is to defend the right of a Muslim woman to wear a burqa, to be thinking about the rights of Sikhs, the rights of Jehovah's Witnesses and the like, because it's so important for us not to be sounding like we're defending our own vested interests, but that we're talking about justice. We're talking about general patterns of religious freedom in this country, and we need to strategize a lot on that. And, one of the problems of the priestly authority is John F. Kennedy had to respond to a lot of criticisms in 1960 because people thought he would be taking his orders from the Pope in Rome. There still is a little bit of a sense that if Romney had been elected, he would be told what to do. And I know that's wrong. I mean, your father would probably tell him, but that's okay. Kidding. Don't tell. Not serious. Not serious.
Well, it's said at UVU, stays at UVU, so it's kind of like Las Vegas around here. So,
But there still is that sense that behind the scenes, the leadership wants to pull the strings, and I know that that's unfair. But just as Catholicism had to address that well beyond John Kennedy saying my religion won't affect my presidency, I think the LDS has a real challenge to be to be clearer and more transparent about the way it engages the public square.
well, thank you. And you put a finer point on something I meant to say, which and I think is spot on, which is wherever we are in this relationship, cozy or wary or collaborative, that it is presidential politics aside, marriage politics aside, it is the religious liberty issue, I think, that beckons into the future a commonality that may help transcend past barriers even more so than what we've seen previously, and I think that's exactly right. Let me just pose one more question, and then we can open it up. In terms of the presidential component of it, what do you make on the legitimacy argument? This idea that for a Mormon to win the White House just adds a sense of legitimacy and prominence that aids the LDS missionary work and opens up doors and gives a profile that we evangelicals, we just can't afford to be party to that, because in the quest for souls, it gives too much thrust to Latter-day Saints.
Thank you. It's an important question. I don't sense that it's being asked much. I did not hear a lot about that, and I travel around in a lot of different places in the evangelical world. I heard some questions about Mormon doctrine. I heard some questions about church-state relations in general, but I did not hear a lot about, well, this will just give them more credibility. I think there is enough of a sense that when you have Orrin Hatch and Harry Reid in the United States Senate, neither of them seem to be using or their influence, nor is it the result of their leadership that people will be nicer to Mormon missionaries when they come to the door. I just don't think that's...
Okay, I think, Brad, we open it up to the floor for questions in this area.
Let's take a student question or two, and then I want to spend a few minutes opening it up to more general Q&A. So students?
My take on gay marriage is we need more separation of church and state. It's better for church liberty. It's better, if ministers are administrating a legal contract, then why can't the law come and tell them how to do so? So would you, I know that's a very brief way to give my argument, but feedback?
No, that's a good question, and I think your point is a good one. And if that were just the primary issue, I think it would be one. But there's a set of larger issues before we even get to that, I think. It's easier for me to say this than others of you here, but if the argument is that something, quite apart from church, something should be allowed to be considered a marriage, if it's in accord with deep convictions, what would keep plural marriage communities from saying, look, we consider it a marriage when a man has 17 wives, Or as in the case of the Netherlands right now, 3 lesbians who want their 3-way relationship to be considered a marriage. It is, people do not want to get into the slippery slope argument, but it is really an argument, and that is if the criterion is granting a plurality of sincerely held views on what constitutes a marriage to become legally sanctioned, aren't we opening the door? What does the gay lesbian community have to say? But well, yeah, we want ours, but we would never go that way. And what would logically or rationally prohibit that? So I think right now the larger question is not just defending the traditional view of marriage, but once we take one step away from a definition, a traditionally held definition of marriage, what would keep us from taking 5 steps away from that? And I think that's a real issue. I wrote for Newsweek on this, and they would not let me say that. They said, you know, you can't use the slippery slope argument. Well, I don't want to say it's slippery slope. I just want to know what the answer is to people who defend it. And that's, I think, a very important issue. So right now, I'm more concerned about the general health of society, where we're having I think, an important argument about what should be legally sanctioned as a marriage. I think that's a good question, but I'm not sure I want to stop with the answers that are presently being presented.
As a young LDS member or young evangelical, what would you say is the most important thing we can do now together to protect our religious freedoms and rights?
Well, for one thing, to keep a focus on that case, the whole issue thus far has been framed in terms of the civil rights of individuals to follow through on their orientation. And that's a very important issue. But there's very little attention given to this, as it were, the civil rights of communities. And it feels like if we go one way on the individual rights question, we're going to preclude the attention to the other question. And so I think we just need to be focusing on that, and not in an arrogant way, but just say, it looks like different states are allowing a certain community to engage in legally sanctioned relationships that were previously prohibited. But what about the question of those communities that have been around for a long time, who also configure their life in terms of certain kinds of convictions? What about that? And we're not hearing a lot about that, but the LDS is Governor Levitt and a guy in California, Gary Lawrence, and others have been working along with Elder Clayton and others with an organization in Washington, D.C., working with the Southern Baptists and with Catholics and others, evangelicals, on the question of religious liberty. And I would hope that a younger generation will support all of us on that. While at the same time, I think we need to do a better job of understanding the reluctance of a younger generation to identify with what looks like a hateful attitude toward gays and lesbians, many of whom we love as friends and even as kinfolk. Yeah.
My answer to that would be major in political science. So, I just say that because our department chair is here, and I know he wants to plug.
Smiling ear to ear. But we have a few more minutes for questions. I want to make sure that those who had questions from the general audience are able to ask them. So please.
President Holland, this question, I guess, is directed more to you, but with your background in studying how difficult it was for us to preserve a union, create and then preserve one, do you see these kinds of issues like the marriage issue potentially polemic enough that they could lead to the destruction or the unraveling of the civic union?
Well, it's a timely question as we are a few days away from the sesquicentennial of the Gettysburg Address, actually next week. I've written a little something on this for the paper for this weekend. So it's a very live issue. I hope not. I would hope that the fabric of the Union in the aftermath of what we learned through the Civil War and something like the Gettysburg Address would be strong enough to hold us together despite our differences. That said, I do think there is a growing tension in the land on this issue. To just give you a preview of what I'm arguing in the paper this weekend is when Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address, he talks about the country being dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Some contemporary scholars have seized on that to say, well, Lincoln takes what was a truth in the Declaration and makes it a proposition, something, not yet proved, not yet a given. And they try to make Lincoln some form of postmodern thinker there, that he can't embrace truth and it's propositional. I don't think that's what Lincoln's up to. I think he's saying that it's not the truth that all men are created equal that's in question, it's America's commitment to that. And that's what's propositional. And that's the next line, that it's a test. The nation's in a test to see whether it can long endure under that principle. By the end of the speech, though, he's talking about a government of the people, by the people, for the people, but a nation under God. There are two truths then at work in the Declaration, in the Gettysburg Address. One is that individuals are inherently free and entitled to rule themselves. That's the foundational ideal of our constitutional republic. But the second truth is that we are a nation under God. There is a divine order to things that's however we want to vote on, it's not going to change that divine order. And some recognition or acceptance of that is a good and healthy thing for our republic. And so to make a long story short, what I'm saying is that in Lincoln's time, it was a given that we were a nation under God. And it was propositional that we were committed to all men are created equal. Now I think we've flipped that. There is nobody in this country who would challenge the doctrine that all men are created equal, or that some people are by inherent ability or design or last name or civic gifts or virtue are entitled to rule other people. We would just reject that out of hand across parties, across religions. Only the sort of most fringe elements would reject that sort of doctrine. But we have a growing sense of undecidedness now about whether we're a nation under God. And so if there is a test into the future, it won't be about equality. It'll be about religion.
Bob.
I think I heard that there was Robbie George, who made the comment that in the last election, he felt that the Mormons had done their job, that the evangelicals had basically done their job, but that the Catholics had dropped the ball. I'm interested in why you think you might say that. What do you think you had in mind?
Well, I don't know that particular statement, but I guess I can draw some points there to say that I think, again, it was a spirit of organization on the LDS side that got so many people sort of out on the streets, so to speak, and a kind of an energy on the evangelical side that happened without the superstructure that the Catholics have. Maybe comes back to this sort of priesthood question. There was this sense that, well, the Mormons could do it, but the Mormons are organized. They've got these structures, and yet the evangelicals stepped forward. They didn't quite have the same structure, but there was a lot of energy and emphasis. Then there were the Catholic side. They still have the structure, not unlike the Mormons, but it didn't seem, they should have had that a bit more of an advantage that way, and it didn't seem to translate into the same energy that was seen on the evangelical side. I think Robbie would say something to that extent.
As we talk about all this, I was wondering, sometimes as we speak with our in-laws and other people, we feel sort of a fear that they have towards us. And this isn't an academic question or anything, but what would you suggest when we need to deal with that on a person-to-person basis? What would you suggest for us? Because we've gone way beyond wanting to convert anybody or anything like that, but we feel that fear coming from our evangelical friends very often.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's, all I can say is that I think we can learn a lot from the good things that have been happening. And, you know, I have found that much can be accomplished in terms of just personal trust, which is really the issue. If we genuinely pray together, we worship together, I mean, it would be great if you've got a evangelical in the family to ask that person to pray for the dinner or something. You know what I mean? Where you accept that person, and it's especially difficult, I think, when one group dominates the culture, as say in the state of Utah, because you can get into a real minority feeling on this, and I've got to say it works the other way in situations where it's just a couple of Mormons in a large evangelical kind of setting. And so it's probably a lot better in some place that isn't either Wheaton, Illinois, or Salt Lake City, where you sort of have come together on equal ground. But I think there are things that we simply need to do to create trust. And if we create trust, it's got to be based on, certainly in our community. I don't know how you would do it with, say, a Jewish daughter-in-law or a Muslim daughter-in-law or whatever. But when it's evangelical and LDS, I think there are some specific things that we can do. Bob and I have had a couple of cases, at least on my side of things, where I've consulted with him about a situation like that. You know, we had one recently where a couple was going to get married, and there was a real fear of getting married in the temple because you know, would leave the actual ceremony would leave half the family out of things, and those are genuine issues. But I think it would help if we had teams of pastors and bishops who maybe could counsel people together, because more and more we're getting these kinds of questions, you know, where it's about a husband and a wife, a parent and child. And the more we model trust among ourselves, evangelicals and Mormons, the more it and I've had a number of people come to me and say, it's really helped we had a case in Grand Rapids a couple months ago, very poignant. A woman came to me afterward weeping, and she said, I'm an evangelical Christian. She said, my daughter married a Mormon, and she became LDS. And she said, for 25 years, I prayed daily for her soul. I was just afraid she was going to hell. And she said, my daughter died 3 weeks ago. And she said, hearing you and Dr. Millett speak today is the first time that I had peace about my daughter's eternal soul. You know? And just modeling that we could joke together, we could discuss who Jesus is together. For her, that was one of the big moments in her life as a mother. And I think it's so important for us to be reaching out and being, you know, we started those dialogues behind closed doors, you know. But what we've learned in those, and what we've learned in having Al Muller in Salt Lake City, and having Ravi Zacharias in the temple, and I mean in the tabernacle. I'm sorry, I know better. That may never come, but
we don't have press here, do we?
but I think that the more some of us model it in public life, the more it makes it possible in just one more story. My local evangelical church in my town, which has a lot of LDS people, La Cañada, California, and they asked me to come and talk to their Wednesday night group, about 40 people, about the Evangelical Mormon Dialogue. I said, I'll do it, but I want the LDS community invited. I don't want to say anything about it that they aren't there to hear. And after I warned them that they should have more than coffee that night, I bet about 80 Mormons showed up. And two people, an evangelical and a Mormon, came up to me afterward and said, you can't imagine what this means to us. We're next door neighbors. We've never talked to each other before. And we knew that, one was a Mormon, the other was an evangelical, and so we've kind of looked warily at each other. And tonight, for the first time, it just felt like it was okay to talk to each other. We're gonna get together and as neighbors. Now, that's the kind of thing that we need to be working on the grassroots. The ecumenism of the trenches of the grassroots is very important.
We were talking about trust and things like that, and I realized that one of the things that came up to me is with all the social media and how the youth just combines together to share thoughts and beliefs and so forth, and how, I don't know how to put this right, but how the gay movement has used that to really help with their, the same-sex marriages and all that. Is there something that all the churches combined, all of us for religious freedoms, are doing to help the youth know that we can all work to this together? Because I don't think there's a lot of people that realize how our religious freedoms are being affected, and that it would be nice for all the youth to know that all the churches are working together to save religious freedoms, so that there's a positive campaign for the youth to share through those sites.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a very important proposition. But I would say this, that for a bunch of old folks like me to encourage young people to use the social media is probably the wrong way around. I would hope that a younger generation would pick that one up, because it's got to be a natural savvy about social media that some of us, they categorize these days in social media to strangers, immigrants, and residents. And I'm an immigrant. I'm not a stranger to the social media, but I'm an immigrant. I still remember when phones were attached to walls that you never had to ask, as I heard somebody coming off the plane the other day, where are you, on a phone? We just didn't ask that when I was a kid. But it's got to grow out, and I think it's a wonderful idea. That wouldn't it be great if LDS, younger generation, found a way of linking up with, I won't say hooking up because that's bad, but linking up with their evangelical counterparts and some Catholics, and begin a conversation and think about ways in which that conversation can be expanded about these issues. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Again, a special thanks to Dr. Mao, President Holland, Blair Van Dyke, the students who helped prepare the events of the day, and to the special relationship we developed as a group in preparing for this conversation. So we look forward to more of these in the future. Please join me in thanking Dr. Mao.